All right, so welcome once again to the South Central Texas Quarterly Climate Outlook webinars. This one is for summer, and once again, I want to welcome Jason Runyon later on, who's going to give the tropical outlook, and then also Ty Dickinson, our Holling Scholar from the University of Oklahoma, who's going to be helping us for the next 9 weeks improving these climate outlook webinars for the future. He's done some research for this talk as well. All right, so just to kind of summarize what's happened over the last 180 days, spring was generally drier than normal across most locations. As you take a look in terms of what percent normal rainfall it was, you can see that in general, most locations were about 75 to 50% of normal, but we did have some locations out in the Rio Grande Plains, Edwards Plateau, that were quite wet, followed by some locations in Maverick County that were quite dry. So in general, most are below normal, but we did have some wet areas over the western third of our CWA, except for Maverick County. But when you take into account the wet winter that we had, most locations are at least 75% of normal, with most locations being above normal. The one exception to this really being in Maverick County and the Rio Grande Plains, and a small section of Williamson County. So other than that, most spots for the longer term 6-month and greater period are still above normal or right at normal, but we are starting to see some trends towards short-term dryness everywhere except the Edwards Plateau. So because of that, we've been a little dry, but our drought concerns still generally remain low. As we kind of went throughout the spring, when we went into, this should be February 28th instead of February 2nd, you can see that we were drought-free for the most part except for Maverick County and other portions of the Rio Grande Plains going into the spring. And really, by the time we got to the end of March, not much had changed, with some drought expanding to Valverde County. But then April, the first half of it was pretty wet, and so we were able to clear all that out. But May, for the most part, in the second half of April, were quite a bit drier than what they normally are for most of the region, and that has allowed us to reintroduce some drought conditions over much of South Central Texas, or not drought conditions, I'm sorry, drier than normal conditions over much of South Central Texas, with even some D1 drought creeping into parts of Bandera and Bexar County. Now, one thing I want to point out is that this drought designation was put in before it could take into account the rains we just got on Tuesday for this region. So considering that we did get about 3 inches of rain over a decent portion of this region, I'd expect that that will either be cleared out in part or maybe even cleared out entirely by next Tuesday. But for right now, we do have a tiny portion of South Central Texas that is in drought, with about half of South Central Texas being abnormally dry. So as we go into summer, the one thing to kind of realize is if you're trying to plan a wedding, probably the worst time of year to plan a wedding is here in May, because if you look at the climatological percent chance of rain we have, and this is a 7-day running average throughout the year, you can see that for the most part it's highest in May and in December. And so it peaks right around 30% for Austin, San Antonio, which is the line in yellow. I combined the two to kind of make it smoother because we had 2 climate sites there. When you look at Del Rio, it's the highest that it is here in late May, right around 20 to 25%. But right as we go into the beginning of June, those chances start to pretty dramatically decrease. And by the time I get to July 1st, we're down towards 20% for Austin and San Antonio and 15% for Del Rio, and keep decreasing all the way through July until we get to right here in the early to middle part of August, right around 10 to 15% for both locations. And so in general, if you want to have a wedding, you want to have it in summer, except for the heat that we have. But you can notice that right as we get into the end of August, those rain chances start to creep back up and on into September and late August here for both Austin and San Antonio. When you look at the heavier rain chances, one thing that's kind of interesting is if we looked at any rain chance at all, it peaks about 25 to 30% in May and decreases to about 10 to 50% in summer. But if we look at only days where it rained at least ½ an inch, so we had a more significant rain total in those areas, you can see that for Del Rio and Austin, San Antonio, it pretty much is more or less the same, right around 3 to 5% from July 1st until towards the end of August. And so the important thing to realize here is that even though it doesn't rain much, when it does rain, it pours, and it pretty much does so equally for the heavy rain events during July and August, regardless of where you live in South Central Texas, whereas other times of the year it's more likely, say, along the I-35 corridor, hill country, and areas east into the coastal plains. Again, you've probably seen this graphic before. This is one that Bob Fogarty put together for the office, where you can see that May is definitely the peak in tornadoes and severe weather for the season. But our flash flood threat continues to increase on into summer, where it actually peaks in July. So June, July, and August, as a season for summer has the most flash flood reports of any season here in South Central Texas. But it's not like we don't get any severe weather. And so Ty did some research over the last couple of days and found out that, of course, as you'd expect, most of our reports, about 2/3 of them, are due to thunderstorm wind, and relatively few are due to tornadoes. But on days where we had at least 3 severe reports or greater, 5 out of 6, or 83% of them, were really due to weak fronts we get in summer, or some outflow boundaries that might have been set off by fronts or other convection that was pretty organized. And so even though we don't have a significant severe threat for most of summer, particularly as we get out of June, especially in July and August, if you do see that we do get one of those rare fronts that we get 1 or 2 times a summer on average, then you want to be on alert for more than just the random pulse severe storm that might produce 1 or 2 severe reports in a given day. Looking forward to what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks, you can see that we have cooler than normal temperatures predicted for the first half of June, with a relatively dry second half of next week. And so if you look at the temperatures, it's kind of unusual to see CPC for days 6 through 14 showing either equal chance or cooler than normal temps. So that's what they've got the odds tilted towards. It looks like once we get out of this wet period towards the beginning to middle of next week, we should have a brief dry period for the second half of next week before maybe going back to a wetter period, although I say maybe very carefully after next weekend. When you look overall at the entire outlook for June and summer, you can see that in general, CPC continues to maintain the odds fairly strongly tilted towards above normal temperatures this summer, with an equal chance of rainfall for June. This was a recent update. Before, back a couple of weeks prior to this, their June forecast was tilted towards wetter than normal conditions, but now it's pretty much an equal chance. So it's kind of a coin flip at this point based on their forecast. When you look towards July and August, really, it was also kind of equal chance. So I would suspect that the July to September forecast that's put out, and the one that we currently have, is for equal chance. And so even though the odds are slightly tilted towards wetter and warmer than normal summer, the forecasts have been trending slightly more towards near normal rainfall. And the main reason for that is because there's still quite a bit of uncertainty as to whether or not El Nino is going to develop or not. The most likely conditions is going to be ENSO-neutral conditions that are just below weak El Nino conditions, or very, very weak El Nino conditions, right on the cusp. If you look at our weekly sea surface temperature departures in the region that we care about for defining an El Nino, where we have to have 5 consecutive months above 0.5 degrees Celsius, or right about a degree Fahrenheit, you can see that right now we are actually above that at 0.6 degrees Celsius, at least temporarily. But the majority of models, as you look at the CFS and look at all the purple ensemble members, mostly falling below the El Nino criteria on into the beginning of next year. And about half of the models, of which the dynamic models for the IRI are showing a greater chance of El Nino than the statistical models, you can see that in general the models have trended a little bit away from the El Nino developing and a little bit more towards staying in ENSO-neutral, just slightly. And so instead of a 50% chance of El Nino developing at some point between now and this winter, CPC has pretty much a solid, constant 45% chance beginning in the next few weeks through the end of winter. So it's hard to say what's going to happen, but as a result of that, I think that's probably why they've pulled back the precip forecast for June a little bit, and maybe kind of going equal chance on into the next couple of months for summer. So having said that, this does have some effect on our hurricanes, so I'm going to turn this over to Jason Runyon.
Thank you, Larry. This is Jason Runyon, and I'll go through some of the tropical considerations for this summer and this fall. But before we get to that, just some climatology I just wanted to point out and bring to your attention. Dating back to the mid-1800s, when we look at the longest stretches we've gone in Texas without a direct hurricane strike along the Texas coast, the longest time we've gone is 9 seasons, from 1990 to 1998. And we're currently at 8 seasons, with 2008 Hurricane Ike being the last landfalling hurricane we've had in Texas. So from a climatological standpoint, we are getting up there now, second longest active hurricane-free period along the Texas coast. So it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. And on the right there, you can see in that graph there, I just want to kind of point out by month, June, July, August, September, when we normally see tropical storms, hurricanes, and major hurricanes, with August and September being our peaks, but also a secondary minor peak in the month of June. We can often see some early spin-ups in the western Gulf of Mexico, and I'll have a slide on that later. Two slides I just wanted to point out real quick. These are what we call return periods. So for every little circle you see with a number there, this is on average a return period of a hurricane, any hurricane, Cat 1 through 5, within 50 miles of that point. And I just wanted to point out the mid-Texas coast region, in particular the Corpus Christi region. So right now they have gone 47 years, this will be the 47th year, without a landfalling hurricane within 50 miles of Corpus Christi, with Celia in 1970 being the last one. And that region of the Texas coast sees a return period of a hurricane within 50 miles about every 16 years. So we've gone more than double that now, with, again, Hurricane Celia in 1970 being the last one. And then with respect to major hurricanes, these are the Cat 3s, 4s, and 5s. Again, focusing on the mid-Texas coast, Corpus Christi area averages about 33 years for a return period of a major hurricane. And Celia, the last hurricane into the Corpus Christi area, was a major hurricane, so we're at 47 years also with respect to major hurricanes. Before we get to the tropical outlook for this season, just a couple changes to some of the products that you'll see from the National Hurricane Center this year. New change this year, some of the web graphics are going to look a little different, a little cleaner. That cone of uncertainty you're used to seeing will have a different map beneath it. And also we'll have the ability to toggle on, you'll have the ability to toggle on this map the current radius of tropical storm force and hurricane force winds on top of the cone, which is excellent to point out how far impacts can be felt outside of the cone. Now, with respect to the cone, it's just important to note that that cone represents the last 5 years of historical averages from the error averages from the National Hurricane Center. So we know the Hurricane Center doesn't have a perfect forecast, and they go back the last 5 years and take the averages of each one of their 12, 24, 36, all the way out to 120-hour forecast point errors, and they take the average of that and they set that cone, the boundary of the cone, so that 2/3 of all those forecasts fell within that cone. And so that means 1/3 of all the forecasts fall outside of the cone. So it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. Just a comparison standpoint, their forecasts are getting better over the decades with respect to track forecasts. This is looking at their 2-day average track errors, how big that cone was back in 1990 at 2 days compared to where it was last year. So the cone is shrinking in size because their track forecasts are getting much better. However, the caveat to point out is, although the tracks are getting better and the cone's getting smaller, obviously the impacts that can be felt far away from the center of hurricanes and tropical storms aren't getting smaller. So when we go back to that error cone, it's important to realize, especially as these cones are getting smaller and smaller, that there can be considerable population outside of that cone that will experience impacts as far as wind, surge, tornadoes, and heavy rainfall. And then with respect to track errors also, with average, those 5-year average errors at 2 days at 48 hours, what we're looking at, the 5-year average is somewhere just over 70 nautical miles. But it should be pointed out there's considerable variability from storm to storm in any given year. So these are all the storms from last year in their 48-hour errors that they had, their average errors for each storm. And so you can see some storms they did very well at 2 days, and some like Hermine, Ian, Julia, Lisa, they didn't do too well. So just another thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind. And also with respect to track errors, the Hurricane Center tends to do better with stronger systems. The hurricanes, especially the major hurricanes that are longer tracked, that are being steered through the Atlantic and Caribbean, they tend to do a little worse with the tropical depressions and weak tropical storms. Something new this year to kind of keep in the back of your mind, the Hurricane Center will have the ability new this year to issue forecast advisories on systems that haven't even formed yet. So the caveat here will be if there is a system that will impact a coastal location within the next 48 hours, such that they will need tropical storm watches or warnings or hurricane watches and warnings in the next 48 hours. But the system quite hasn't developed yet, but we see it in the models developing. They will have the ability to issue advisories and watches and warnings on these systems, and these will be called potential tropical cyclone advisories. It will basically be the same exact thing as a normal tropical storm or hurricane advisory package, just that the system quite hasn't closed off yet into a named storm. Also new this year are storm surge watches and warnings. So we should point out that half of all the direct fatalities from tropical cyclones are attributed to storm surge. And so that's the main risk that we evacuate our coastlines for. So new this year will be storm surge watches and warnings, and those will be geared towards coastal locations that have a significant risk of life-threatening inundation, which will be roughly about 3 feet of above ground level inundation, roughly. And so look for those watches and warnings, those storm surge watches and warnings this year. So getting into the forecast, first, the forecast is highly tied towards the ENSO cycle. Looking back in the Gulf of Mexico over the last, since 1981, when we look at El Nino years, the main thing to kind of point out in that top left image is during those El Nino years, those 8 years we've had since 1981, the western Gulf of Mexico and the Bay of Campeche have been relatively inactive compared to the neutral and La Nina years. And so when you get to the neutral years, the ENSO-neutral conditions like we're in now and kind of forecasted to possibly stay in maybe a week El Nino, but odds are trending possibly towards more of a neutral conditions. When you get towards the neutral conditions, the western Gulf and the Bay of Campeche becomes a little bit more active. We average about 4 cyclones per year across the whole Gulf of Mexico compared to only 3 cyclones per year during the El Nino conditions. With respect to Texas strikes, actually landfalling hurricanes or tropical storms in Texas dating back to 1981 tied to the ENSO cycle, we're twice as likely to get a tropical storm or hurricane during a La Nina year or a neutral year compared to an El Nino year. And we average about 1 tropical storm or hurricane strike per year when we are either in a La Nina or neutral year. Sea surface temperature is another important component that we look at with respect to the tropical seasonal outlook. Here's the Atlantic sea surface temperature anomalies. Anything in red, light yellow to red, is above normal water temperatures across the Atlantic, Caribbean, and the Gulf of Mexico. Anything in blue is below normal. And you can see a large area of the eastern and central Atlantic is above normal. Portions of the Caribbean are above normal, and portions of the southwest Gulf of Mexico and Bay of Campeche are above normal. So this Genesis region that we see in August and September is currently above normal, and this Genesis region we often see during the early tropical season, during the month of June, is above normal. If you look out towards the North Atlantic, below normal sea surface temperatures, possibly tied towards us trending out of the the Atlantic decadal oscillation, trending towards the cooler phase of that. So with warmer than normal sea surface temperatures across a large area of the Genesis region for long track hurricanes in the Atlantic as well as the Caribbean, and warmer than normal sea surface temperatures in the southwest Gulf of Mexico, combined with the likelihood of us staying in neutral ENSO conditions to, at best, weak El Nino conditions, the official 2017 NOAA Atlantic Hurricane Season Outlook calls for 11 to 17 named storms this year. That is near to slightly above average. We average about 12 named storms a year. We're calling for 5 to 9 hurricanes, slightly above average or near average. We average about 6 hurricanes every year in the Atlantic Basin, and 2 to 4 major hurricanes, and we average about 2 to 3 major hurricanes in any given year. We should point out that it's really difficult to tell which portion of the Atlantic Basin may be more susceptible this year, especially the Gulf of Mexico. Is it going to be the western Gulf of Mexico, the eastern Gulf of Mexico? And that's tied towards more the North Atlantic oscillation, basically where that subtropical high kind of sets up and steers hurricanes. Normally we can only see where that is going to be placed across the North Atlantic about 1 to 2 weeks in advance. So it's very difficult to tell out past June right now where that may be. We should also point out that even though we're predicting a near to slightly above normal hurricane season, It only takes one, and we should prepare in any given year as if this will be the year for a landfalling hurricane along the Texas coast. 1983 was a perfect case example of that with Hurricane Alicia, one of only 6 named storms, 50% of what we see on average. Alicia was only one of 6 named storms that year, causing over $6 billion in damage to the upper Texas coast and 21 fatalities. Final slide here to kind of point out. So if we start off kind of slow in the month of June and July, don't let your guard down. The normal peak to the hurricane season is late August and the first couple of weeks in September. In fact, 2/3 of all hurricanes form after August 28th in the Atlantic Basin, and half of them after September 9th. So don't let your guard down. If we don't see much during the month of June, July, or even the first half of August, the peak is during the late summer and into the fall. One last slide here just to kind of point out the climatological areas where we normally see systems develop by month. Normally in the early summer, it's in the Gulf of Mexico and Western Caribbean. And during July, we kind of get into a lull in tropical activity on average. And then as we get into August and September, that's when we look out further into the Caribbean and the Atlantic Ocean for the longer track systems. So let me pass this back to Larry, who will kind of recap the impacts for the summer outlook and early fall outlook here.
All right, so again, we're going to do another outlook probably here towards the end of August, early September, mainly to kind of see what evolves with respect to not just the NAO and ENSO, but also the MJO, to give you a better sense of what may happen during that time. For fire weather, right now it looks like we're going to have near normal conditions for fire weather, especially with the rain we just got, which was much needed over the last couple weeks here. That has really caused our energy release components to decrease quite a bit over the Rio Grande Plains and south central Texas to at least normal, if not slightly below normal values. And considering we should have some degree of wetness for at least the first half of June, that should continue to keep our fire weather concerns relatively low or near normal. If we look at heavy rainfall and river flooding, again, we're going to maintain normal conditions for the first half of summer and for the second half of summer. A lot of it's really going to be contingent upon whether or not we get some sort of weak MCV circulation or upper level disturbance, or more likely if we were to get a tropical system. As tropical systems, as you can see, and I think I presented this last year, are the main cause of above normal rainfall. In 1998, we had 2 storms, Charlie and Francis, and in 2010 we had 2 storms, Alex and Hermine, that really contributed to making these years some of the wettest years that we've had in our history since 1981. And then finally, for the fall outlook, again, it's going to be either on August 31st or September 7th at 2 p.m., as that will give us a chance right near the peak of hurricane season to give an update and also talk about fall, which currently CPC has a forecast of above normal temperatures, or at least odds tilted towards that, and wetter than normal conditions. Again, that's probably going to be more likely to go down if ENSO is not predicted to occur, and will be more likely to go up if ENSO is predicted to occur. So having said that, we will go ahead and take questions. And thanks again for participating.